At some point in the near future, Yunseo Lee gathered the courage to ask Siwa Kong out. Their relationship is a bit complicated, but respecting the girl's definition, let's call it unique. On the current day, as she was leaving school after the final bell, Yunseo bumped into another girl who had declared herself an enemy. However, she kept walking as if nothing had happened. Seeing that she didn't get Yunseo's attention the way she wanted, the other girl made it clear that Yunseo should stop messing with her boyfriend. At that moment, the protagonist looked directly at her nemesis and wiped her shoulder in a movement that caused discord. On the other side of the ring, the adversary was held back by her friends, or things would have gotten crazy and heads would have rolled. This type of situation is nothing new for Yunseo. Ignoring that girl who was clearly off her rocker, she was called a crook, homewrecker, vile, and a misogynist. If you don't know what those words mean, please don't Google them unless you want to cry immediately. In the comings and goings of high school life, Yunseo's reality was quite sad, especially because of her relationship with a boy named Siwa. Since they were close, the girl was the target of envy and bullying by other girls in the school who also wanted to be close to the handsome guy or simply wanted to push him away from her. "My boyfriend, give me a break and stop embarrassing yourself. You two already broke up," thought Yunseo after the last provocation she faced. The worst part is, although she was used to it and knew how to deal with these threats better, the truth was that the girl still felt bad about these things. Like in this case, for example, that girl shouldn't be mad at her. She should be mad at the guy who caused all this confusion. Speaking of which, there he was, before our eyes, the root of this controversy, the curse in Yunseo's life, the most beautiful and sensual man in the world, a true magnet for girls, himself. Siwa Kong. According to him, the handsome boy had been waiting a long time for his friend to arrive, as they were supposed to go home together with the ghost driver. Inside the vehicle, according to the girl, the big culprit behind this irritating noise pollution was this lunatic, tapping away on his mobile phone like a gorilla and playing Candy Crush music at maximum volume. Siwa was an insufferable pest. And in case you don't know who this young man is, which is probably the case, at least I hope so, for your mental health, here's a brief introduction. This lucky bastard inherited the most refined genes from his parents, who are famous actors, and that's why he has this polished, good-looking face. Accustomed to being the center of attention since birth, Siwa learned to speak at 2 days old. At 2 weeks, he was solving math problems. At 3 months, he founded a political party called PU just to troll a political opponent. And at 5 years old, he was responsible for the theoretical formulation of North Korea's nuclear program, his great comrades. In a few words, hey, Siwa Kong is our king. People often say that Kong is like the sun, like the sea, like the stars, like the moon, and he'll devour you too if you're not careful. In fact, it was precisely because Yunseo was so close to this sun that she got burned. Although she didn't understand why this guy was nicknamed the Sun, the raw and simple truth is that the boy lit up the path wherever he went, and if you looked directly at him for too long, you could end up with a black spot in your eye. In Yunseo's case, it was more the second option that happened to her, because to her, this jerk was a real pain in the ass. For Yunseo, Siwa was just a... What? Siwa asks. Well, to Yunseo, Siwa was the sun that set her peaceful life on fire, the root of all evil. But it's not just that, of course. "I thought you were staring at me because you had something to say," the annoying boy added. "Put your phone on vibrate, it's loud as hell," the girl finally spat out. It's not just that because, on top of everything already mentioned, young Kong is also the protagonist's childhood friend. To be precise, they've known each other for 16 years, 2 months, for weeks, 27 days, and 7 hours. To be even more precise, they've known each other for as long as they can remember, maybe even before that. They've always gone to and from school together, studied together, gathered together, everything you could imagine. They're practically inseparable, so close that they get sick of each other. The only thing they don't have in common is that Yunseo has 3 nipples and is an athlete. Siwa, on the other hand, prefers to play the piano. Their mothers have always been BFFs, but Yunseo thinks it's a bit too much for her taste. For example, where will this all end? Will she and this human turd go to college together, then work together, live together, have kids together, die together? Jesus Christ, how horrible. Someone, please separate Yunseo from Siwa immediately. Anyway, looking at that angelic yet devilish face, Yunseo asks if he received a bill or something because the guy's expression soured instantly. He replies that today's tutoring session was canceled, so Yunseo starts thinking about what she'll do with her free time. But the boy reminds her that it's because of her birthday. By the way, he's already excited about his best friend's party because his mom has been preparing the cake and the Winx Club theme since early in the morning. And the cake is strawberry, the birthday girl's favorite. Listening carefully to those words while her mind wandered slightly, Yunseo pondered that this was Siwa Kong. As his nickname suggests, he shines and shines like the sun. Everyone Yunseo knows likes him, and among those people, we can include herself. A few hours later, the strawberry-laden cake was already on the table. Both of the guests were singing the Korean "Happy Birthday" to the birthday girl, who was enthusiastically thanking everyone for the love she was receiving. Siwa's mom handed the lucky girl her present, and Yunseo wasted no time opening the box to find a beautiful, shiny necklace that must have cost the price of a kidney on the black market. But it wasn't just any necklace. It was the one Yunseo had wanted for a while, which was surprising because she'd only recently started eyeing that piece of jewelry. The woman explained that Siwa had told her about it, but their conversation was interrupted when a house staff member called for her. Yunseo looked at the necklace with deep admiration and then smiled genuinely in joy. Beside her was Siwa with his usual annoying posture, tapping his finger on the table like an insufferable brat. However, instead of yelling at the boy like she usually did, Yunseo did the exact opposite. She reached out her hand toward him, confusing the boy. Then she asked for his present too. After all, it was her birthday. Also, if he didn't want a slice of cake, she was more than happy to take it. Siwa replied that he had already given her a present on her 2006 birthday, those weightlifting dumbbells, and reminded her that she already had a piece of cake on her plate. In response to this insult, Yunseo didn't hold back and called him a shameless jerk, so he came up with an argument to clear his name. What else do you want besides this necklace? A ticket to Disney? A fighting rooster? A shirt autographed by Ciro Gomez? You need to tell me so I can get it. This boy trying to be nice is very strange. There's definitely a catch, no doubt about it. Yunseo knew this very well, but she was left speechless by the boy's unexpected behavior. And since the girl was a bit stunned, Siwa demanded that she tell him what she wanted by the end of the day, or else there'd be no gift at all. Hearing that, Yunseo thought that her relationship with Siwa was special. She believed that, just as Siwa was special to her, she was special to him too. With that in mind, and knowing that nothing ventured, nothing gained, Yunseo gathered all her energy to ask a question that could change the course of her story with this boy forever. The question she asked, we already know, as it was the scene that opened this story. Awkwardly, Yunseo asked her friend to go out with her, but it wasn't just the usual hangout. It was something more like really going out, you know? Anyway, Yunseo thought she could be special to Siwa, but when she saw that shocked look on his face for the first time in her life, the worst crossed her mind. At that moment, Siwa spat out his drink and coughed incessantly, leaving the girl extremely embarrassed. Not believing what he'd just heard, he asked Yunseo to repeat what she'd said so he could process her words more smoothly this time, without being caught off guard. Hearing this, Yunseo, who wasn't dumb, quickly pretended it was all a joke, just kidding, a prank. And then, to avoid the awkward tension in the air, the smart girl got up to grab some napkins to clean her face since the rude boy had spat on her. Okay, the excuse was decent. But the real reason the girl wanted to leave the table was so Siwa wouldn't see the pulsating redness on her face, her heart pounding so hard that it bent her ears, and her head spinning out of control. And mainly, the consequences of the words that had escaped her mouth faster than her brain could anticipate, leading to this desperate attempt to simply run away. Heading straight for the bathroom, Yunseo looked at herself in the mirror to see the result of the disaster on her face, while being invaded by the sad certainty that this birthday would forever be remembered as a terrible memory. On the other hand, Siwa would pretend this event never happened, which ended up being better for Yunseo, but the decision she made within herself was that she would never again confess her feelings to anyone, and that she would never allow herself to feel this way for someone else again. By completely shutting herself off emotionally, Yunseo hoped to erase this episode and keep Siwa close, but she couldn't even do that. Years later, when Yunseo Lee was 22 years old and already studying physical education, it had been quite some time since her friendship with her best childhood friend had ended. In the middle of a university orientation, while the advisor was emphasizing that if a student missed for classes, they would fail the entire course, all Yunseo could think about was that Siwa had left the country, and now she had no idea how his life was going. In the never-ending flow of days, these years seemed to have had no meaning. The woman had held a secret crush on that boy for so long that she couldn't even remember when it started, and now that time had passed, she couldn't say how long it took her to get rid of that feeling. In that room, the advisor was calling out the names of students for attendance. Amid these thoughts, Yunseo received messages from Herring Cho, asking if she had made it home safely last night because she had stopped responding at some point. While replying that everything had gone fine, the advisor called the name of Siwa Kong from the business administration course. However, the most surprising thing was that when called, Siwa responded, "Present." In fact, his voice was much closer than Yunseo could have expected, so close that the boy himself asked if she was deliberately ignoring him, her longtime friend. Hearing that, Yunseo snapped back to reality and slowly began to process the situation. "Long time no see," said the boy who had now become a man. Yunseo was sure she no longer had feelings for that boy. Until that moment. "Siwa Kong?" she asked. "Yup, it's me," he replied. Yunseo went into a panic and asked what this hellspawn was doing in this dump. But then the advisor gave her a scolding for disrupting his work. Embarrassed, Yunseo apologized and retreated into insignificance, while the most handsome and beautiful among the beautiful sat next to his old friend. While the advisor explained that the students would have to watch a movie and write a review about it, the girl couldn't help but look at Siwa as if she were seeing a ghost, especially because of the boy's pale skin, which indicated that he hadn't seen the sun since leaving the country. Trying not to disturb the advisor's lecture, she wrote in her notebook, asking if he had returned to Korea for good, to which Siwa turned his eyes to his friend, who was trying to avoid any eye contact. Then, with his usual charm, he answered her question with another question. Probably, Yunseo was annoyed by the guy's insane word games because a simple yes or no would have put her mind more at ease. In a way, it seemed like Siwa was seeing the situation as a joke, even though it was far from Yunseo's perception of this unexpected event. Keeping the same vibe, Siwa commented that he was surprised by his friend's long hair, then asked if she had missed him. Despite everything, going against herself, or maybe not, the troubled girl replied coldly that she hadn't. This answer wiped a bit of the smug expression off her friend's face, who was used to feeling like the center of attention. So he observed the vague and hesitant look of his old friend, unable to understand why she responded the way she did. Meanwhile, as the orientation continued full steam ahead, Yunseo was so caught up in her thoughts that she didn't realize the lecture had already ended. With that, Siwa asked if she had any plans for the rest of the day, and, since she didn't, he invited her for a walk. Always wearing a face like she'd lost a $100 bill on the subway, Yunseo hesitantly followed the handsome boy. Outside the university, Siwa tried to calculate how long it had been since they last saw each other and concluded it had been 4 or 5 years. Yunseo, on the other hand, replied that it was around that time, even though she knew full well it had been 6. At the same time, she was puzzled that the idiot didn't even know how long he'd been gone, until a very direct question grabbed the girl's attention. "Yunseo, why are you being so cold to me?" The boy wanted to know, "Did you really not miss me at all?" Saying that, the bastard took on a passive-aggressive stance, pressuring the poor girl for an answer as he slowly approached her. In her mind, Yunseo recalled the last time they had spoken. At the time, she had texted Siwa on KakaoTalk, saying that at the very least he could have let her know that he was leaving. But not only that, she also asked him to reply in a sad, needy gesture. With a cold reply, Siwa simply texted back Sunday, July 31st, as if it were some kind of automatic response. Of course, Yunseo missed him. That was obvious. After all, she had liked the boy a lot, and they had always been inseparable. But that was years ago, and now everything had changed. With that in mind, Yunseo shooed the guy away, hoping he'd stop pestering her. As she turned her back and walked away, Yunseo commented, "As self-centered as always, I see." This strange conversation was very frustrating for the girl, but she saw no way to fix it. As if that wasn't enough, Siwa replied that she was being quite cruel with her attitude, as she wasn't showing the slightest bit of joy at his return or listening to what he had to say. Finally, he confessed that he was a bit hurt. Yunseo pointed out that she had answered every question the wannabe vampire asked, but he thought her mind was wandering with each response she gave. Refusing to let it go, Siwa insisted on the same question, still looking for a seemingly honest answer. Seriously, you didn't miss me at all? The bastard asked again. Yunseo lost her patience and asked if the guy had anything else in his vocabulary besides that line. Just like on that fateful birthday, Yunseo feared she might slip up again and expose herself like before, so she remained on the defensive, insisting that she had nothing to say to her old friend. However, Siwa made it very clear that he still had something to say to her. Hearing those words, Yunseo froze on the spot and heard Siwa's slow footsteps approaching. After a brief pause, she turned back to him and asked what he wanted. That's when he replied, "I missed you all this time." At that moment, even though it was late afternoon, the last rays of the sun in the atmosphere shone brighter between the two of them, and the glow that highlighted Siwa's face directly reminded her of the strange nickname he was called by. Siwa, the sun. In that instant, it felt as though everything had changed at once, as if the years had rolled back and the two friends were still in their teens, when everything was simpler. However, tearing through the veil of nostalgia with her sudden presence, another girl appeared, hugging the man from behind. Visibly surprised, Siwa tried to make sense of what was happening by asking how Yuna had found him. But Yuna didn't have time for silly questions. She wanted to make out in the middle of the courtyard, so she grabbed the handsome boy and planted a big kiss on him. Meanwhile, Yunseo remained petrified at the sight of that grotesque scene, because there was no doubt about what was happening here. Siwa is dating this woman. And on top of that, it wasn't just a normal kiss. It was a public display of frantic affection that would make anyone uncomfortable, especially poor Yunseo, who not only used to have feelings for the guy, but was also standing just a meter away from the lovebirds. Realizing this, she asked to leave because things were getting awkward. However, both of them stared directly at her in silence, causing her to completely lose her cool and have no idea what to say. Thus, the couple ignored Yunseo and continued their verbal smooching, expressing how much they missed each other. Finally, Yuna wanted to know who this random girl was that her boyfriend had been talking to. "Just a friend," replied Siwa. "Promise she's just a friend?" The girl insisted. "Yep," the boy confirmed, nailing the final nail in the coffin. Yuna confessed that she had been worried this girl might be some old flame that neither of them could handle properly, considering they'd been best friends since childhood. But of course, that wasn't the case. After all, as Yuna quietly whispered to her boy, this girl looked pretty different from the others Siwa had dated. This one seemed to have the wrong genitalia. Setting that aside, Yuna completely ignored Yunseo's existence and invited her boyfriend for dinner with her and Yun. So Yunseo frowned and left, but Siwa grabbed her hand and asked her to wait a second because he still had things to say, as he had made clear before. So he told his girlfriend that he already had plans for tonight and said, "See you later. Hasta la vista, baby." After saying those exact words, Siwa pulled Yunseo away, leaving his clingy girlfriend behind. A little further ahead, Yunseo wanted to know what this guy was doing. Thinking to herself, she reflected that Siwa had probably said that to get out of something he didn't want to do because he had always done that since they were kids. One day, at school, while the girls were swooning over the stud, he only cared about where Yunseo was going, offering to carry the box she was holding just to escape the others. Knowing this, Yunseo was never too keen on the way he started conversations in those moments, as it felt like she was just an excuse for him to avoid dealing with what he didn't want to face. Unable to shake that perception, the girl bluntly stated that Siwa was using her as an excuse again and that he hadn't changed one bit. "Oh, is that what this is about?" Siwa didn't care at all about what the girl had said. Then he pulled her along again, saying he was hungry and not even bothering to ask her to buy him food. He simply said, "Buy me food," without even a polite "please." Yunseo was confused by the guy's fraudulent behavior, so she made sure to ask what on earth was going on, to which he explained that she was the senior and he was the cute freshman, so she should buy him food. Understanding even less where this jerk was going with this, Yunseo wanted to know how she could possibly be considered a senior, but at the same time, she didn't want to deal with any more nonsense, so she told the guy to buy his own dinner. In response, Siwa couldn't understand why she was so against the idea because it had been several years since they last saw each other, and now Yunseo was so reluctant to spend a few bucks to feed an old friend. Besides, he came back to Korea all alone. His dog died from overbreeding with the neighbor's dog. All his friends died from urinary incontinence. And now his parents hate him because he spent the family's savings buying cattle heads, but forgot he didn't own a farm. So they all ran away. With his poor Korean skills, he couldn't make any new friends, so he was just a lonely boy in this cruel world. Yunseo hadn't seen that coming, so she started thinking she'd been too harsh on the poor guy, but then she quickly remembered that she was dealing with Siwa Kong, the sun, and that memory alone was enough to remind her that she couldn't possibly be too mean to a jerk like him. Finally, Siwa took the girl's hand and declared that she was all he had, so he didn't understand why she was treating him like this. Hearing those carefully chosen and delivered words, Yunseo staggered backward and nearly fell, as the glow emanating from that man was blinding. Gripping her hand even tighter, Siwa gently called her name, making her close her eyes and brace herself for anything possible in this world, as Siwa and predictable were not two words that could exist in the same sentence. With some difficulty, Yunseo asked what the man wanted, and he asked, "What do you want to eat?" "I want a nice homemade meal to fill my belly." Years ago, back in their teenage years, Yunseo was engrossed in reading a romantic manhwa, which piqued Siwa's curiosity about whether that junk was as good as the girl made it seem. In the midst of that, he touched the girl's wrist, causing her to become so embarrassed that she reacted with hostility to his approach, slapping his hand away. Siwa began to cry like a lost puppy, even though Yunseo was sure she hadn't done anything to make the faker so upset. So, she accused him of acting, but he insisted that he was gravely wounded by her bloodthirsty attack, showing her a small cut on the tip of his index finger. Realizing that the situation was more serious than she'd thought, Yunseo apologized, while the suffering boy asked how he would be able to carry his backpack without one of his fingers. Feeling awkward, Yunseo downplayed the situation, saying it was no big deal and that the boy was being overly dramatic, but Siwa directly appealed to her, asking her to carry his bag because the pain was so intense that it would probably be the last act of kindness she could do for him, as Siwa likely only had a few hours left to live. Then, with his pleading eyes, the boy asked if Yunseo could do him this little favor. Faced with the circumstances, the poor girl didn't know where to look, trying to figure out when she had killed her own friend. Back in the present day, Yunseo had the exact same dumbfounded look as she carried the devil in her own home after being charmed by that pleading act once again. Still, she insisted that they shouldn't eat dinner at her place because her mom was a terrible cook and that she could pay for a meal outside, even if it cost a fortune. Regarding that, Siwa understood what his friend was saying, but to be honest, he'd been eating at those fancy, boring restaurants ever since he returned to Korea, and everything he ate tasted the same. In other words, he would love to eat a homemade meal to feel alive again, something he hadn't experienced since his skin had turned so pale that he looked like a ghost. Either way, with his hand on his face in a sad, dramatic expression, the man left the decision in her hands, saying that eating out one more time wouldn't make him any more miserable. With that, Yunseo freaked out briefly and unlocked her door, letting the demon feel at home. In the end, that's how Siwa ended up inside Miss Yunseo Lee's house after so long. The boy asked where his friend's mom was, so Yunseo explained that she was in the hospital at the moment, as busy as she always was. Reflecting on what she could feed this pest, Yunseo didn't know exactly what she could cook, not even whether that tomato-flavored instant ramen in the pantry had expired. On second thought, the girl didn't think she should worry too much about this freeloader's meal, so she relaxed a bit and went in search of something for dinner. When she opened the fridge, there was sliced bread, eggs, some vegetables, and nothing else. That's right, the lady of the house was on a strict diet and didn't have a frozen pizza to pop in the oven, so this was all there was for the night. Searching around, the girl noticed there was still some instant rice left, and that was it. Rice, rice, and more rice. In her words, a total disaster. Siwa wanted to know if there was a problem, and Yunseo pretended everything was fine, but she wondered if she should order food or something because the situation was tense. At that moment, Siwa got much closer than Yunseo was used to, almost sniffing the back of her neck. Then he asked, "Can I change my mind?" "Well, here we go again." "Galvio bueno. What do you want, man?" Yunseo asked. "I only have rice, salad, and kimchi in this house. It's tough." Hearing that, the boy got closer and closer, making Yunseo wonder if, in the end, the meal would be her. Trying to maintain emotional control in this delicate moment, Yunseo heard her name escape Siwa Kang's lips once again. Then, as the panels of the manhwa moved forward with little variation, we saw that the boy was getting closer and closer. That's when Yunseo screamed, "What?" Back on the day she had hurt the boy's finger, Yunseo remembered how clingy he had always been. Sometimes he followed her around like a baby duckling. In the end, he always got what he wanted with his beggar-like ways, not to mention the usual charm he threw at his friend. On that particular day, he had made her carry his backpack all the way to class. The closer Kong got to Lee, the more nervous she seemed to get, not knowing how to react to a moment that was becoming increasingly intimate, increasingly close, making Lee close her eyes out of shyness. After a long stare, saying everything without saying a word, Kong reaches for something on a shelf behind Lee. He grabs a big Monica's Gang tomato-flavored instant noodles and asks if he could scarf down a big plate before heading out, completely cutting off the tension that had her heart beating even faster. At that, she stops, takes a deep breath, and the jerk even flashes the most smug smile possible, asking if everything was okay, leaving Lee with no choice but to grab his shirt and give him a solid knee to the gut that would make even John Cena applaud. After practicing some MMA on her childhood friend, Lee turns on Journal Nacional on the TV, where Fatima Bernards is reporting on the weather, noting the high chance of a strong wave hitting and a monkey ending up on top of a pole. Lee glances at her kitchen and sees the heartthrob waiting for his noodles to finish cooking in 3 minutes. She notices his radiant presence and recalls the image she had of her friend back in school, analyzing how much he's changed, but, at the same time, how he still seems like the same person. After a lot of overthinking and staring at the sun in her kitchen, she notices what might be the biggest change in her friend. He's no longer a 5 feet 6 inches guy and has grown a lot, now towering over her. She can't believe the size difference between them, even though she considers herself above average in height. Oh, how unique she thinks she is. Kong, acting like a kid just starting solid foods, discovers that his tomato noodles are spicy because he rushed in without reading the label. Lee instantly notices the situation unfolding and hurries toward Kong like a puppy running to its owner. She pours him a cold glass of Coke to drink, thinking that despite being 6 feet 3 inches, a Taylor Swift fan, and hating cramps, he's still the same dopey kid from their childhood. She asks, if you can't handle spicy food, why do you insist on eating it? This makes Kong first pull a what I want is easy kind of face, but he quickly takes the chance to flirt. He gives Lee the most seductive look he can muster to thank her, throwing her brain into a full system error because of his accent. Lee, not used to that kind of accent, blurts out that it's real English, only to get a sharp comeback from Kong asking if fake English exists. Regardless, it left Lee completely on edge, but was it because of the accent or desire? The question remains. Kong then thanks her for the drink and downs it in one go, as if he were at a bar with his friends, where everyone would shout, "Chug, chug, chug." This leaves Lee wondering what on earth they must have put in those noodles for him to drink that fast. It was then, with Kong still drinking from his glass, that he gave Lee a sincere stare. She stared back, noticing that his shirt was still tattered from when she decided to practice some taekwondo on him. Feeling a little guilty and nervous, Lee flinched when Kong slammed the glass on the table, commenting that her stare was so intense he felt like a hole was about to appear in his beautiful face. Lee tried to come up with an excuse, but the only thing running through her mind was how hard she had been trying to avoid looking at Kong precisely, so this wouldn't happen. She was quickly interrupted by Mr. Pretty Boy himself, who confidently declared that her stare was because she missed him terribly. Lee turned completely red, wishing she could bury her face in the ground like an ostrich. Her mind was spinning with questions she wanted to ask Kong. When did you come back to Korea? What have you been doing all this time? And especially, why didn't you text me to let me know you were back? But she held back, afraid she might accidentally blurt out her disappointment. Managing only a week, it's nothing. Kong hit her with a "stop being crazy, girl," and urged her to just let out whatever was on her mind, reassuring her that it was okay to ask. Lee paused for a moment, almost breaking her composure, before turning into a chatterbox, like a 5-year-old who asks, why about everything. She bombarded him with questions. Did you really come back for good? Or do you have to leave again? If you're leaving, when will it be? Kong, clearly amused by the range of her expressions, simply answered with a smug, I don't know. Lee fired another question. When did you even get here? And Kong, in his usual sly and sarcastic tone, revealed that he had been around for about 3 months. I don't even need to describe Lee's reaction to that. Lee was about to ask a question she wasn't sure she wanted the answer to when they were interrupted by a call. It was possibly from his little girlfriend, since the person was inviting Kong to dinner. Kong, sounding annoyed, asked the caller if they were deaf, reminding them that he had already said he wasn't going to dinner tonight. However, tomorrow's a new day, but he couldn't promise anything. During the call, Lee wondered who it could be, suspecting it was his girlfriend. She thought to herself that, given how much time had passed, there was no reason for Kong not to have a girl in his life. She grew nervous about the answers Kong had been giving since his return, feeling strangely unsettled by her own reactions. She didn't even recognize herself. When the flirty heartthrob finally hung up on the poor soul's collect call, he turned back to Lee and casually asked where they had left off. Without thinking, Lee blurted out, "Was that your girlfriend on the phone?" She immediately froze, startled that her furious concern had slipped out so spontaneously. After unintentionally asking if the girl on the phone was Kang's girlfriend, Lee starts questioning what kind of issues she has in her head. She turns completely pale, embarrassed, and frozen, unable to react. While trying to process everything, she couldn't shake the idea that the girl, who seemed so close to Kong earlier and was on the call, might actually be his girlfriend. But then Mr. Hotshot reveals that the girl was not his girlfriend, but his younger sister. Very strange, I'd say. As they stared at each other, Kong wore that shameless, cheeky smirk of his, while Lee had the soft expression of someone utterly lost, trying to process the situation. Finally, she blurted out, "What kind of bizarre nonsense is this, dude?" For Lee, there was no way that girl could be Kang's younger sister when she was clearly taller than the guy. Kong said it was a complicated story or something like that, and we dive into a flashback of the time they used to ride home together from school. Lee recalls wondering why Kong had broken up with someone back then, assuming there had been a fight or something. She later found out that the reason was simply that he found the girl too annoying and didn't really like her. At the time, this revelation left her relieved, but now she realizes something else. The guy is just a jerk. Lee glares at Kong with the most judgmental look possible, thinking about how unlucky she is. This leaves Mr. Heartthrob feeling awkward. As he asks her why she's giving him that bitter, unloved look, Lee then asks if Aunt Warren knows about all this. What she really wanted to ask was whether Aunt Warren knew how much of a jerk Kong was. But instead, she just muttered that if Warren found out what Kong was up to, she'd wring his neck. Just then, Journal Nacional begins reporting on the 10th anniversary celebration of the Hoax Sharing Foundation, which helps the less fortunate in society. The foundation had just received a small donation of 100 million won. The donor in question was actress Han Ji, already well known for her philanthropy and good deeds. She stated that throughout her life, she had been helped by many people, and now that the favela has won, she wants to give back all the love she's received. Her total donations now amounted to 1 billion won. Lee comments on how amazing the actress is, saying how famous she is in Korea after starring in a primetime drama. She reflects that no matter how much money someone makes, donating isn't easy. This makes her think of Aunt Warren again, the same aunt who would strangle Kong with a necklace of her own fingers if she found out what a jerk he is. Warren also donated a lot, so every time Lee saw the actress, she remembered her aunt. After this nostalgic moment, Lee notices that Kong looks like he's seen a ghost. Worried, she asks him what's wrong. Kong snaps out of his daze and casually agrees that it really is amazing. But Lee, who isn't naive, senses that something's off with him, as if he's hiding something or running from someone. Lee tries to say something, but Kong interrupts her, checking his phone and saying a job has come up. This makes Lee wonder even more why Kong suddenly looked so strange. She starts questioning herself. What did I do wrong? Why is he like this? Frustrated with Kong for saying absolutely nothing, she grabs his arm and demands to know why he's acting so on edge all of a sudden. She wonders for the umpteenth time if she messed up somehow. To Lee's relief, Kong tells her that he's not mad at her, that she didn't do anything wrong. But this only leaves her even more confused. Unable to stand being there any longer, Kong simply turns around and says, "Bye. See you around." Lee's stunned, is left standing there with her bread face, watching the jerk walk away. The scene cuts to Kong, sitting on the edge of a filthy sewage canal, looking visibly depressed. He gets a call from someone named Kong Shiwa, but doesn't answer, letting it go to voicemail. In the morning, Lee looks like a zombie, since she didn't get a wink of sleep the entire night. The events of the previous evening with Kong kept replaying in her head, all because that bastard was acting far too strange, saying, "Don't worry about me." Suddenly, Lee receives a message on her phone, and she rushes to check it, thinking it might be from that jerk. But when she picks up her phone, she sees it's just spam promising that Tigrinho is paying well and doubling her initial bet. Lee practically falls backward, realizing it's not the message she was hoping for. With the most depressing expression ever, she continues thinking about the night before, especially the part where Kong said he wasn't mad at her. She keeps wondering, if he's not mad, then what's the reason? At Korea University, a woman enters the classroom looking for Kong. She mentions hearing gossip that he wouldn't be attending today, which is quickly confirmed by the entire class in unison, like a choir. The woman seems concerned about why he isn't there. Could he be sick? Could he be hungover? She asks if anyone has been in contact with him and requests that if anyone does hear from him, they let him know to stop by the coordination office when he returns. The entire class is left puzzled by the strange scene, with some even speculating that the woman might be flirting and interested in the charming playboy's body. One of the students starts stirring up drama, whispering to the rest of the class that Kong must be getting special treatment, if you know what I mean, wink wink. Everyone starts paying even more attention to the theory, and the guy continues, questioning who would even care so much if a student skipped class. He points out that no other teaching assistant would be this concerned about whether someone was sick or not. He finishes with a smirk, saying that something smells fishy, and there's definitely something going on behind the scenes. Another student chimes in with a sleazy tone, suggesting that the woman might be doing more behind the cameras, fueling the gossip even further. The instigator wraps it up, asking, what kind of crazy nonsense is that idiot talking about? The rest of the students in the room look disgusted by the toxic comments and mutter amongst themselves that they'll make sure not to sit with those guys during lunch. At the university's court, Lee still can't get the situation out of her head. Girl, let it go already. Thinking to herself that she hasn't heard a word from that bastard. She feels foolish for waiting for him to call, but tries to convince herself that she doesn't really care. Not even she believes what she's saying. Lee is caught off guard when an annoying girl suddenly pops up, asking if she wants to sign up for a Riachuelo credit card. She nearly jumps out of her skin in fright, looking like she just saw a ghost. The girl even apologizes for startling her before going back to listing all the amazing benefits of getting a Riachuelo card, only to be interrupted by their professor, who tells them to stop chatting. Lee was saved by the bell, narrowly avoiding a full-on cardiac arrest. During the court activities, the annoying one keeps chatting with Lee like a clingy tick, asking if Lee went to the occupational therapist and how it went. Lee responds that she obviously spent 3 hours sitting around, and it was useless. Lee starts venting to the clingy one, saying it was a relief because there were no exams in the end, but she then asks why she, the clingy one, didn't go to therapy. The girl explains that the therapist isn't taking appointments, only for Lee to quickly correct her, saying the therapist is accepting patients. This causes Herang, the tick in question, to stumble mid-run, completely losing her composure. The professor immediately asks why Herang isn't running properly. Lee then, jokingly, expresses interest in the Riachuelo card offer, asking Herang if she's getting involved in yet another pyramid scheme. A brief description of Herang follows. She's a classmate who became friends with Lee during university. She wasn't just some random stranger offering credit cards to people. Herang mentions that she joined some random training club and gives Lee a short description of it. It's a bunch of weirdos who meet 2 or 3 times a week to exercise. Depending on the number of people who show up, they even do group activities. Herang enthusiastically says how much fun it is. Lee is already exhausted just from hearing Herang talk. The girl keeps pestering her, insisting it would be so much fun if they did it together. Lee, however, has zero interest in joining a club to exercise. Herang, undeterred, continues with her arguments, saying there's no mandatory attendance. Lee, feeling a little nervous about the answer, asks who the other members of the club are. To her surprise, the answer is that the only crazy person in the group is literally Herang herself. Herang, all excited, tries once again to convince Lee to join. Lee responds as dryly as the Sahara Desert, saying she's not going to join. But Herang, like a spoiled child who has never heard the word no in her life, keeps insisting, repeatedly saying how much fun it will be. Lee refuses again and starts wondering how Herang can run so fast while still finding the energy to keep nagging her about joining the club. This girl is relentless, huh? At the end of the run, Lee is completely dead from running at a much faster pace than she was used to, while Hirong, who didn't even look like she had broken a sweat, keeps pestering her like a playful child, asking if Lee will join the club. That's when Lee realizes that Hirong won the run. Lee had never managed to win in any athletic event. Resigned to her defeat, she accepts the invitation to join the club, with an expression that screams, "I'm going to regret this." Hirong wastes no time and takes the lead, creating a WhatsApp group. Lee immediately questions why she's making a group if the club only has the two of them. But the spoiled kid is optimistic that more people will join. Here comes another description of Hirong. Her full name is Jo Hirong, and she's a third-year physical education student. She's also the national champion of the third event at the National Athletics Festival. Right off the bat, she spots an acquaintance and wastes no time trying to convince her to join the club too. Hirong asks Suyin if there's a basketball game happening tomorrow, since she plans to go as well, and receives a positive response. Without missing a beat, she pitches the club to Suyin, asking if she'd be interested. Suyin seems intrigued and asks Hirong to explain more. In the middle of their conversation, Lee receives a WhatsApp message that says, "I'll talk to you later." She thinks to herself that this was expected and that she's still foolish for holding on to even a shred of hope. Suddenly, Hirong reacts dramatically to something, startling Lee. She exclaims that she forgot to register the club, saying it would have been a disaster if Suyin hadn't brought it up. Hirong, acting as if she's in a cartoon, announces that she has to run to the administration office as quickly as possible before they close, leaving Lee and Suyin behind to say their goodbyes. On her way out of campus, Lee wonders what she'll have for dinner. She considers inviting Hirong to eat with her and even thinks about grabbing a plate of rice somewhere along the way to satisfy her hunger. But something catches her attention, and she looks to the side. She spots someone playing basketball, a striking figure surrounded by a crowd of admirers swooning over the guy. It's none other than Kong himself. Lee freezes, completely shocked, unable to believe what she's seeing. Seeing Kong right in front of her playing basketball, Lee wonders if she used some expired product or if she's just imagining things. Maybe it's because she hasn't slept all night, and she thinks she's hallucinating from exhaustion. She can't believe her own eyes. Kong Siwa is there, playing basketball. She even compares the scene to a drama series, which, incidentally, is literally the genre of this manhwa. But anyway, still in disbelief, Lee notices Kang's aura. Wherever he goes, he's always the center of attention, the popular guy. Then Mr. Heartthrob, all sweaty from the game, notices Lee and calls out to her. He walks toward her, making her turn as red as a sunburned shrimp, and asks when she arrived. Lee scolds him, yelling at him not to leave in the middle of the match. Immediately embarrassed, she realizes she said it without thinking. Kong, looking like he has no idea where he is anymore, just tells her to wait because he's going to crush those noobs in basketball and will be back soon. He then invites her to have dinner with him. After this overly dramatic scene, Lee feels incredibly awkward, wondering why she always acts like an idiot when she's in front of that jerk. It's always so humiliating for her. When the game ends, Kong comes back to Lee and asks if her athletic spirit was the reason behind her earlier outburst. Lee immediately retorts, throwing it in his face that not leaving in the middle of a match is the most basic rule of sports. She adds that she wasn't even mad at that moment, but Kong insists that he felt like he'd be annihilated if he messed up again. Lee just tells the jerk to shut up and grab his bag. Without looking, she grabs the first backpack she sees on the ground and hands it to him. Luckily, it turns out to actually be his. Lee then asks why Kong is hanging around this part of the university, as it's the physical education department. He responds that, obviously, he was just waiting for the princess to pass by. He says it's because he didn't have her number and decided to wait to run into her instead. This makes Lee reconsider all the suffering she went through the entire day, waiting for even a single sticker from Kong. Before starting any conversation, Kong mentions that he's starving and invites Lee to grab something to eat. She ends up agreeing. Then, in his usual teasing way, he starts asking if Lee is mad again, wondering what's wrong with her and what her problem is. They're interrupted by a girl trying to hit on Kong, saying she saw him playing basketball earlier and thought he looked pretty hot. Lee, trying to avoid the same situation she's already dealt with before, steps aside to distance herself, tired of facing this scenario over and over again. She thinks to herself that Kong really is impressive and must be exhausted from the game and all. But then, out of nowhere, Kong casually puts his arm around Lee's shoulders as if they were a couple. Leaning in close, he whispers playfully in her ear, asking what she wants to eat, saying she can choose anything, and he'll go along with it. Lee starts to cry, not literally, but emotionally, her face flushing red as she looks up at Kong, who's gazing back at her with that not-so-innocent look, fully aware of what he's doing. Lee is left completely speechless, but quickly realizes that Kong is using her to keep the clingy girls at bay. With his arm around her, they look like a couple, and the girls immediately back off, apologizing because they don't want to seem like homewreckers. Lee can't help but feel pity for the poor girls. They decide to grab some street food, cheap barbecue skewers, and start talking. Lee asks Kong what it was like living abroad, whether it was difficult for him to get used to speaking a language other than his native one. Kong explains that it wasn't too hard, since everyone there was really friendly to him. He offers Lee some of his food, and the gesture reminds her of how he used to act in the past when they were kids. But the Kong Siwa sitting next to her now feels different, very different from the boy she knew back then. It's hard to explain, but everything feels so strange because it's the first time she's seen Kong get so irritated. Usually he seems so cheerful and carefree. Lee reflects on how the Kong she knows was always smiling and full of joy, but she's starting to realize that people can change over the years. Lee is still obsessing over what she might have done wrong the night before. Seriously, she still hasn't gotten over it, and keeps replaying the scene in her head. She recalls the news about the generous donation made by the Globo actress and makes a mental comparison between the people who came to mind, including her aunt. Seizing the moment, Lee asks how his aunt is doing, adding that her mom would be thrilled to know Kong is back. Or maybe she already knows, considering their moms were the nosy neighbor duo who gossiped about everyone on the street and couldn't stop talking to each other. Kong slams his can of orange fauna on the table, clearly irritated, and snaps at Lee, asking why she mentioned his mother. Lee, caught off guard, defensively responds that since Kong decided to go buy cigarettes abroad without telling anyone, her mom eventually found out. But halfway through her sentence, she regrets bringing up the fact that he left the country so suddenly. Once again, she berates herself internally for speaking without thinking, calling herself an idiot. Lee decides the best option is to just be straightforward and ask him everything with confidence. After all, it's been a long time, and she doesn't even care anymore. She finally blurts out, "What kind of fun little things were you doing over there that you couldn't even send a simple text to your best friend? You jerk?" The question leaves Kong completely speechless. Meanwhile, on Twitter, a heated discussion is unfolding about Kong. People are speculating whether that hot guy from business school has a girlfriend. Many replies insist it's impossible for him not to have one, with women jokingly and not so jokingly saying they're desperately ready to throw themselves at him. Other comments talk about the guys being jealous, wondering if he's rich, a TikTok influencer, or something else entirely. There's also a question about why people at the university call Kong Rainbow. Theories start flying. Some say it's because he's hard to see, but when you do, it's something wonderful, while others pile on compliments for our not-so-beloved Kong. However, one controversial question pops up. Someone asks if the rainbow doesn't look suspiciously like the Globo actress Hanji. After Lee bluntly asked Kong why he didn't send a single message while he was away, Kong remains paralyzed, unable to react to the question. This forces Lee to ask if something is wrong, why he's acting like this, and if something happened to his Aunt Warren. Kong denies everything, insisting that nothing's wrong, all while gripping his fauna cup tighter and tighter. Lee doesn't buy that little lie. She fires back, saying that if nothing happened, why does he have that funeral face in front of her? She urges him that if something's wrong, he just needs to tell her. At that moment, Kong ends up knocking over a cup of water onto the floor, which immediately worries Lee. She asks if he's okay, or if he somehow managed to hurt himself with a plastic cup of water falling. But Kong, still looking completely depressed, says everything is fine and asks the waitress for another glass of water. The waitress, already worried about the restaurant's 5-star rating, asks if the food tastes awful, but Kong insists he just wants another glass of water. Once again, Kong has this expression on his face that worries Lee. It becomes painfully obvious that something isn't right, but she's already starting to accept that he won't say anything. If that's the case, she thinks then he's an absolute idiot for acting like this, pulling that expression like he's craving attention, when every time she asks anything, he dodges the question and says nothing in the end. His mood is so heavy it's infecting the entire room. Lee then wonders who exactly he's craving attention from. Clearly, he doesn't want to say anything to his best childhood friend, and yet he's not even trying to hide it that blatantly. Lee starts to feel guilty for being so worried about her friend, but realizes that apparently only one person is acting like a friend here, and it's obviously not that idiot Kong. She wonders if he holds some resentment toward her or something like that, but all those doubts will remain unanswered. Even after all this, Lee still questions herself. Why did Kong simply show up out of nowhere in her life again? After dropping Lee off at home, Kong says goodbye, leaving Lee wondering what she should do next because she still didn't have his WhatsApp to send him a good morning sticker. She calls him back and Kong simply turns around and extends his hand like a beggar asking for money to buy booze. Lee, completely nervous, thinks that he wants to hold her hand, but in reality, he just wants her phone. She freaks out, blurting out an absurd excuse about how she had just eaten barbecue and felt warm because, after all, people need to eat hot food to keep their bodies warm. Could there be a worse excuse? Not satisfied with that, she tries another excuse, saying it must be because of spring, which had made the weather warmer. While Kong is adding his number to Lee's phone, she can't stop rambling on about how hot it is, saying she's not even wearing a coat and that Kong must also be hot. She was just short of suggesting they both take their clothes off right then and there. After adding his WhatsApp number to Lee's phone, Kong calls himself collect because he assumes Lee doesn't have any credit, just to add her number to his phone too. He tells her she can call him anytime during the day. Back inside her house, Lee still can't believe that the heartthrob had really given her his number. She notices that his number is still the same as before, that he hadn't changed it even after being away for so long. She thought she would have forgotten the number, but as soon as she saw it, it brought back memories of when she used to receive endless prank calls from him. At that moment, it hits her. If the bastard didn't change his number, why didn't he answer even one call? The jerk really only does what he wants. Was he avoiding her calls because he didn't want to talk to her, or was something else bothering him? But again, she reinforces the thought that she's the only one who cares about this friendship. Kong sends her a goodnight message, and she just sits there, deep in thought. At Kang's house, he's staring at a family portrait, his eyes lingering on his mother. Suddenly, a woman appears and begins speaking to him. She mentions how Kong leaving the house the way he did had left his father and her very worried because he wouldn't even answer their WhatsApp messages. She grabs his arm, saying she understands that he's going through a difficult time. But in the middle of the conversation, Kong yanks his arm free because he doesn't want that disgusting hand touching him. He tells her to stop pretending that she cares about him and flat out says that he'd like to reserve her a little room in the city cemetery, as delicately as ever. The woman gives him a villainous chuckle and tells Kong that he needs to accept the situation they're living in because, no matter how much he continues acting like the spoiled brat he is, nothing will change. This leaves Kang's self-esteem completely crushed. With a tone dripping in seduction, the woman asks if there's really not a single thing about her that he likes. Then, with venom laced in every word, she adds, "How did you end up being so much like your mother?" Kong starts to dwell on his past, remembering his last sad memories with his mother, where he begs her not to leave. While Kong sinks deeper into his depression, his stepmother starts bombarding him with harsh words, making him feel even worse, throwing in his face that it was all his fault, that he was the reason his mother was dead. She asks what he could possibly change if he kept acting alone, leaving Kong in his room, crying his heart out. Switching to a lighter scene now, at SCU Zay's bar, the little troublemaker proposes a toast to everyone present, drawing attention with her cheeky attitude. Lee watches the whole thing with a face that says she's had enough. While Lee sips her ice-cold beer peacefully, the girls nearby start whispering about the new transfer student, Kong. They start getting all giddy over the idea of having someone that good-looking in their classes, talking about how popular he is and mentioning that he's doing some different course in college. One girl asks another if she's had the honor of speaking to the handsome guy yet, but apparently, all she's heard is some gossip about him studying business administration. Of course, the girls then start speculating whether Kong has a girlfriend, agreeing that with a face like his, it's impossible for him not to. Overhearing bits of the girls' conversation about Kong, Lee keeps drinking her beer like it's water, wondering why the alcohol is going down so smoothly and if she should order another round from Seuz. Before she can, a girl suddenly shows up with another beer for Lee, wasting no time asking if Lee knows that tall, handsome guy who was playing basketball the other day. She asks who he is and, obviously, if he's Lee's boyfriend. Lee starts making comparisons in her mind, remembering how similar this kind of talk was back in school, when everyone was always curious about her best friend. She tries to pretend she doesn't know him, but her attempt fails miserably. Before she can even say anything, every girl within a 5-meter radius gathers around to dig for more information, as if Kong playing a casual basketball game was a World Cup final. Poor Lee starts feeling overwhelmed by all the girls trying to get a piece of Kong. One wants to know if they're friends and if Lee can introduce her, another asks for Kang's OnlyFans pics, another wonders if Lee is dating him, and yet another compares him to some other guy. Then, one of them drops a question that makes Lee almost spit out her beer. The girl asks if Lee might have a crush on Kong. Lee starts trembling like a chihuahua, denying everything, saying they're just friends, that there's nothing special between them because they've known each other since they were kids. It's almost like she's trying to convince herself that they're just friends. Sensing an opportunity, the girl who asked about the crush presses further, saying that since they're just friends, Lee could give her Kang's number so she could send him a photo in view once mode. She even shows Lee her phone, ready for her to type it in. Lee stares at the phone and just says that Kong wouldn't really like receiving random messages from anyone. After feeling overwhelmed at the bar, Lee steps outside to get some air and starts looking at her messages with Kong on her phone. In reality, their conversation never went beyond that one good night text on the day they exchanged numbers. She locks the screen with the most annoyed expression possible and mutters to herself that she knew he wouldn't send any messages and that she was foolish to get her hopes up, knowing exactly the kind of person he was. Then, she hears voices coming from an alley. Being the nosy person she is, she goes to check out what's happening. There are two guys pinning another guy against the wall. One of them says that if someone bumps into someone else, they should apologize, and that if the guy had been paying attention to where he was walking, this wouldn't have happened. While the two are threatening the poor guy, Lee starts wondering who they might be, upperclassmen, perhaps, and who the guy being threatened is. Was he a freshman, or what? After a while, she realizes this seems to be the start of a street fight and quickly runs to find someone to help. When she looks around, she sees people casually walking down the street as if nothing is happening right there in the alley. In a moment of madness, Lee decides to turn back and try to break up the fight. But as soon as she turns, she sees that the bullies have now become victims of the mysterious guy, who walks past Lee and gives her a piercing stare. She hesitantly asks if he's okay, but he just brushes her off rudely and walks away, leaving Lee utterly confused. Shortly after, the little troublemaker shows up, frantic and asking if Lee is okay or if that guy had hurt her. Lee explains that they just bumped into each other and it was nothing serious, but by then, the little troublemaker is already crying out of worry for her friend, wanting to make sure she isn't hurt or anything. She says she'd gone out looking for Lee and was caught off guard by the scene she stumbled upon, while the mysterious guy calmly walks away like nothing had happened. Lee gets home completely exhausted because, honestly, so much happened. The first thing she wonders is how the little troublemaker can be so full of energy all the time. She just wants a hot shower and to go straight to bed, but when she looks at her apartment door, she sees none other than Kong sitting there waiting for her. He simply says, "You're pretty late." With Kong in her house, Lee desperately tries to call her mom, but every attempt goes straight to voicemail. While she panics, hoping her mom will at least read her texts, Kong starts snooping around her house. He tries opening a random door, which turns out to be Lee's room. She quickly runs to stop him from entering and seeing all the K-pop band posters plastered across her walls. Kong quickly apologizes and asks where his room is. Naturally, Lee has no idea why he'd even ask such a thing, thinking about telling him that his room is obviously at his house. But then Kong asks if Lee's mom didn't tell her anything and drops a bombshell. From now on, he'll be living there with her. Lee is left utterly confused, wondering what kind of hallucinogens Kong must be on. Once again, the rascal starts opening random doors, this time entering Lee's workout room. But Kong, being as bold as ever, just walks right in. Inside, they find the room completely empty, and Lee starts wondering where all her stuff is gone. Kong, already feeling at home, starts taking his clothes off right there. Lee asks again if this is some kind of prank or if he's really going to live there, questioning why her mom would do something like this. Then she remembers this isn't the first time something like this has happened. Back in her childhood, her mom had randomly decided that Lee should ride to school with Kong every day in his car. On one of those rides, Lee's mom even texted Kong saying she wanted them to be together. Lee reflects that her mom must think Kong is the favorite child because she sent him a text instead of her own daughter. She also recalls all the other times her mom tried to push them together, like the time she wanted both of them to take piano lessons together. At this point, Lee concludes that, knowing her mom, there's a 100% chance she orchestrated this whole situation. Kong then starts to open up, saying he ran away from home. Lee gets really curious, but then the scoundrel starts unbuttoning his shirt, saying he wants to take a shower. He asks if Lee plans to just stay there and join him. She turns red as a shrimp, yells that she's not staying, slams the door, and runs off, completely embarrassed, while Kong smirks cheekily. Grabbing a glass of water to hydrate after sweating nervously from seeing Kong undress, Lee mumbles about how she once again got distracted by the extraordinary beauty of that bastard's face. But when he comes out of the room, she plans to ask him why her mom thought it was a good idea to let him live under the same roof as her. Then Kong emerges from the shower, wearing a black robe and drying himself in the most seductive way possible. He knows exactly what he's doing with that demeanor. Lee falls right into his trap, going pale as she chokes on her water, spilling it everywhere. She wonders when he even brought his luggage because he showed up at her door wearing only the clothes on his back, yet somehow he now has a robe and slippers. She tells him to put on some decent clothes so he'll stop distracting her because she has something important to talk about. But before she can continue, Kong stops her in her tracks with his robe slightly open, showing off his muscular chest. He asks what she wanted to talk about, while Lee can't help but stare at him, still damp, with water droplets trickling down his face and chest. Lee keeps replaying Kang's words about running away from home in her head, unsure if he was telling the truth or just making a lame joke. She can't figure out what's going on with him that he won't share with her. But putting that aside for a moment, she decides it's time to set some ground rules for living together. The first rule: wear clothes, no walking around the house in a bathrobe. Her heart couldn't take it for too long. The second rule: no opening other rooms without permission. And the third rule: they have to pretend not to know each other while on campus. For now, those would be the rules, and she'd add more if she thought of them later. However, Kong grabs the pin from Lee's hand and says there's another rule to add. He writes down that at least once a day, they have to do something together. It's almost as if she's adopted a dog and now has to take it out for a walk every day. Lee doesn't understand this rule, but Kong says it's nothing serious, just eating together or watching Netflix, or maybe Netflix would end up watching them. The king of Pityville emphasizes that he feels very lonely eating by himself since he doesn't have many friends due to his poor Korean, though he seems fluent in the language of self-pity. Lee asks Kong how long he's going to stick with that flimsy excuse, saying she doesn't understand what she did wrong. After some time spent trying to process her friend's shameless audacity, she says she hates the rule because she already has other people she eats with too. She even starts feeling a little guilty, thinking she might have been too harsh on Kong. But he counters, saying that if Lee won't follow his rule, then he won't follow hers either. And without missing a beat, he starts doing a strip tease in the middle of the living room, sensually taking off his shirt. This leaves Lee in a mix of emotions, better left unsaid to avoid demonetizing the video. Lee sees no other option but to cover her face with the rule sheet, unable to handle the sight of the seductive man standing in front of her half-naked. She calls him crazy, demanding to know why he suddenly took off his shirt for no reason and feeling obligated to snitch to her mom about everything that's been happening. But Kong, being his usual cheeky self, simply stands up, lowers the notebook Lee was using to hide her face, and, getting closer and closer, says in the most devilish voice possible, "If you tell her everything, wouldn't your mom side with me?" Lee feels her knees go weak and reluctantly accepts the truth. No matter how much her mom loves her, she knows her mom would always take Kang's side. Admitting defeat, she hysterically pleads for Kong to put his shirt back on and says these weird antics have gone way too far. But the scoundrel just asks what exactly she means by weird antics. Still completely embarrassed by the scene, Lee tries to clarify some things about the rule, as she's worried Kong might ask her to do something problematic or difficult with him. But with the cheekiest grin ever, Kong simply asks why she'd think he'd propose something hard for her, though Lee's expression makes it clear she's not buying it. As their conversation winds down, Lee gets a call. Thinking it's probably the little troublemaker calling to bother her again, she picks up her phone, only to see it's her mom. Finally, the old lady calls her daughter back after 34 missed calls and 90 messages. If her life depended on it, she'd be doomed. Seeing it's her mom, Lee runs off, saying she needs to take the call, leaving Kong alone and abandoned in the living room. During the call, Lee lets loose, ranting about how the lunatic Kong must have escaped from the psych ward and is now claiming he's going to live with her. Worse, he says it's all with her mom's permission. But her mom calmly confirms it's all true, saying Kong is going through some issues. Lee can't believe what she's hearing. Why is her mom suddenly talking about this? What issues? And aren't they both grown adults now, too old to be living together under the same roof? She thinks to herself that her mom is once again taking Kang's side and asks if her mom ever considers her feelings when making these decisions. Then she brings up Waran, Kang's mom, and asks what happened to her. That's when her mom drops the bomb. Her aunt has gone to have tea with Queen Elizabeth. Lee is left completely shocked. Returning to the living room and seeing Kong sitting there watching Netflix, Lee starts reflecting on the revelation she just had. She convinces herself that she should stand by Kong, even after all this time. She couldn't abandon her friend like that. Lee knew how much her mom cared for Kong and his mom, but she wonders why her mom is so invested in them. Sometimes it even makes her feel a little hurt. But now, more than anything, she feels she should support him. Apologizing for taking so long on the call, she asks what Kong is watching. He says he's watching Back to the Future for the 1000th time. Lee, apparently lacking some culture, asks what movie that is and if it's fun, then sits down beside him. The room falls silent as they watch the movie, but Lee can't focus. After hearing about her aunt's passing, she keeps thinking about what Kong said earlier, that moment when he was undressing in front of her and said her mom would take his side. She feels foolish for thinking he was just being a jerk and wonders if she should talk to him normally. Her thoughts are interrupted by Kong, who, in a question straight out of a deep late-night conversation, asks what time period Lee would go to if she had the chance. Since the movie focuses a lot on that, he's curious, but his question isn't about distant times like the medieval era. He wants to know if she would go back just a few years. Lee says she wouldn't go back to any moment, but it's just an excuse. She doesn't want to admit anything before hearing what Kong has to say. She returns the question, and after an awkward silence that feels like it lasts several panels of a comic, Kong simply says he wouldn't go back either because it wouldn't make any difference. Lee starts to think that, despite everything, the present is just how it is, that life is always unsatisfying in some way. She grows increasingly worried about how normal Kong is acting and decides it's best to ignore this part, pretending she doesn't know about his mom's death. She changes the subject, asking if Kong wants ice cream because she's going to buy some, and leaves the room almost crying with a heavy heart. While out buying ice cream cones, Lee is shocked by the amount of ice cream they end up getting. Kong teases her, saying she's a glutton, just like Magali from the comics, and effortlessly devours at least 3 cones at once. Not only that, but he could also take down several hot dogs in one go. Lee tries to defend herself, saying she's not in her growth phase anymore and has stopped eating like a maniac. She even asks if he thinks she's a pig, but Kong reminds her that her old nickname was literally that. Wanting to change the subject, Kong asks if Lee is cold because he wants to warm her up, noting that she's only wearing flip-flops. Once again, Lee's mind drifts back to Kang's mom. She resolves not to leave him alone at any moment, wondering why he hasn't mentioned anything. She decides that until he's ready to open up, she'll pretend she doesn't know, not wanting to be too invasive by asking directly. Lee finds herself almost crying in the middle of the street. Kong, noticing her distress, asks if she'd like to sit down because there's something he wants to tell her. Sitting down and enjoying their popsicles, Lee keeps staring at Kong, wondering if the subject he wanted to talk about was his Aunt Waran. She starts to panic slightly, trying to figure out if she should say something to comfort her friend, questioning what she should do. Then Kong breaks the silence, saying he's about to cry because Lee just won't stop staring at him. He'd been trying to act like nothing had happened, but he couldn't keep up the facade with Lee looking at him like she was staring into his soul. He asks if she already knows everything about his mom. Lee grips her popsicle tighter, apologizing for already knowing the story despite Kong trying to keep it hidden. But he tells her there's no need to apologize. Once again, Lee finds herself lost in thought, unsure of what to say at that moment. Is he okay? Obviously, he's not. What happened? But that's not something she could ask. In the end, the only thing she could mention was that Kang's father has a girlfriend. Kong moves closer to Lee, leaning in as if to whisper something in her ear but failing to get the words out. Lee, naturally, asks what he's trying to say. This time, Kong finally speaks, revealing that he already knows about his father's girlfriend. This triggers a flashback to their school days, where they're sitting in a car, and Kang's phone screen shows evidence of his father's infidelity. Kong mutters in disbelief, saying he can't believe what he's seeing. Lee, curious as always, asks why he's acting so strange and sneaks a peek at his phone. Kong quickly flips his phone face down, refusing to let her nosiness get the better of him. Back in the present, Kong continues sharing this drama, which sounds like something straight out of a Joao Kleber episode. He says that when he found out about the affair, he struggled with whether or not to tell his mom. In the end, he chose to stay quiet because if he were going to be a gossip, he'd work for a tabloid. He thought his family was perfect and was terrified that speaking up would tear it apart. But, of course, that wasn't the only reason he kept quiet. Regardless of his reasoning, he genuinely believed that if he didn't reveal the affair to his father, everything would go back to normal. Unfortunately, that only happened in his head. He then recalls the same sad memory he had earlier, his final moments with his mom, possibly her leaving after discovering the affair. In that moment, she begged Kong not to leave. But Kong felt guilty, thinking his mother was in that situation because of him. He tells Lee that after that farewell scene, his mother passed away. Left feeling alone and with nowhere he wanted to go, he saw no other solution but to return to Korea, even though he didn't want to. However, he had read a letter from his father apologizing and expressing a desire to rebuild their family differently. When he returned to Korea, though, he was greeted by the supposed mistress, who tried to be friendly, or at least pretended to be, saying how much she wanted to meet him. Kong didn't recognize her immediately, but he knew exactly who that deceitful woman was. Seeing her trying to take on the role of his mom and living under the same roof as him was unbearable. It felt like she was trying to steal his mother's place. Unable to endure the situation, he decided to run away from home, vowing never to return because living in that environment was suffocating for him. Lee starts to compare things in her mind. That picture-perfect Kong, as bright as his name suggests, always the center of attention, adored by women, someone who never seemed to have problems or weaknesses, who was unbothered by trivial issues, the guy who had the best of everything. How did he lose it all and end up renting a place now? But the guy wasn't completely foolish. He made sure to take his credit card, linked to his father's account, with him. While claiming he wanted to leave everything behind, he couldn't quite let go that easily, and of course, the credit card was the one thing he didn't leave behind. After all, the snake his father is now dating wanted Kong to accept the situation without complaining. Or better yet, just disappear entirely. But Kong wasn't going to complain, because in the end, all he wanted was to squeeze some money out of his father. He admits he feels like trash. Lee imagines there must be a reason why Kong feels this way. She just wants to know what it is. She thinks he might be hinting at something for her to figure out, but she wishes he would just say it outright so she could understand him better. Lee believes that if she could sympathize with him, they could work together to solve his problems. But then she realizes she's being selfish, unable to process all the fragmented information Kong is giving her. Feeling her friend's remorse, Lee sees no other option and gives him a comforting hug, wanting to show she's there for him. She tells him he's not sucking money out of his father, but instead, he should use it as revenge and max out that old man's credit card. After all, his dad's rich and probably wouldn't even notice, and none of this is Kang's fault anyway. Kong then asks if that's really all he should do. Just spend like there's no tomorrow. Lee confirms, saying he should buy whatever he wants, but adds that maybe he could get rid of that hideous bathrobe, though deep down, everyone knows the real reason is that she can't handle seeing him in that outfit. However, she immediately takes back her comment when she finds out it's a Prada robe, joking about how luxurious it is and saying it was just a silly remark. Kong then looks deeply into Lee's eyes and asks if she's trying to make him feel more comfortable. Lee replies that, of course, she's trying to help her friend. Kong starts leaning closer, almost kissing her. The closer he gets, the more flushed Lee becomes. She knows exactly what's about to happen, and she keeps asking herself if this is really the right moment or not. And after questioning herself so much about whether this was the right moment, completely frozen and paralyzed, Lee seems to be giving in to temptation and accepts that she's about to kiss her friend. However, just before the act is completed, Kong gently pushes her shoulder and steps back. The two are left staring at each other in an incredibly awkward moment until Kong breaks the silence, saying, "My bad, that was immature of me," completely ruining the mood and leaving Lee utterly speechless. Kong then stands up, saying he's leaving, while Lee remains frozen in the same position, eventually collapsing onto her bed. Kong retreats to his room, sitting in a position like he's deep in thought or squatting in the woods, blaming himself for leaving home the way he did, calling it a reckless move and saying he acted like a child running away from his responsibilities. Another flashback begins, this time from their school days, showing a group of people gossiping about the special treatment Kong always received. They complain that it's unfair and admit they're jealous because the mama's boy always got everything handed to him without any effort. Their grumbling is interrupted by the arrival of the boss, Lee, who scares them off with their tails between their legs. She then turns to Kong and asks if he's upset. Kong, clueless as ever, asks if she's really talking to him, even though there's no one else around. Lee remarks on how Kong manages to stay so composed while listening to people gossip about him, saying truly awful things. She adds that the day Kong speaks up, they'll stop, but Kong replies that he wouldn't know how to hold back if he did, fearing he'd go overboard. He says he doesn't want his parents to hear about it, and that it's just easier to play dumb and ignore everyone. Kong questions if it's really necessary for him to turn into the Hulk over this. Lee wraps up the conversation by saying she'll take on his burdens and become the Hulk for him because she'll always stand by his side. The flashback ends, returning to the earlier moment when Lee hugged him for comfort. Back in the present, Kong reflects on how foolish he is and how, even after all this time, Lee hasn't changed much at all. As expected, she still cares deeply about him. Meanwhile, Lee is now at college in a floriculture class, where the professor is explaining the semester's exams. They're supposed to keep a journal about their own plant and also learn basic first aid. Of course, Lee isn't paying attention to any of it. She's still frozen, replaying the almost kiss with Kong in her head, wondering if it was a dream and how she'll live with that moment stuck in her mind. Suddenly, she lets out a desperate scream in the middle of class, shouting that it's madness. Naturally, everyone around her starts staring, thinking she's lost her mind. Embarrassed and not wanting to end up in a psych ward, Lee scrambles for an excuse, saying how crazy beautiful the flowers are and how she doesn't know which one to pick. Surprisingly, the little troublemaker seems to buy her excuse. Lee starts choosing which flower to use for her project, thinking it should be something easy to grow. She finds a cheap one, reasoning that if she messed up with it, she could just buy another. The shop assistant then comments that Lee picked a begonia, a plant so easy to care for that even a complete idiot wouldn't have any trouble, and that it would bloom in about a week. This becomes Lee's official choice, but the woman adds that the plant has a meaning. The begonia symbolizes unrequited love and is popular among women. Needless to say, Lee's mood takes a hit after learning that little detail. The shop assistant, acting like a mercenary, urges Lee to choose more plants to increase her purchase total. But Lee panics, no longer wanting a plant whose meaning perfectly matches her current situation. She decides to pick something else and starts asking about other options. She points to another plant, saying how unique it looks, but the assistant simply tells her it's hard to take care of and not suitable for a beginner, making Lee feel challenged. Lee can't shake the meaning of the begonia from her mind, refusing to believe it applies to her and deciding not to worry about it anymore. She heads outside the store to buy a pot for her plant. On her way, she spots none other than the handsome Kong arriving at the shop, surrounded by people because he's insta-famous. Naturally, Lee panics, feeling her sanity slipping away, and hides from him. Kong, meanwhile, is looking at sunflowers. Lee starts questioning why he's there, covering her mouth to avoid making any noise. One of the girls nearby asks Kong if he likes flowers, commenting that most of the guys she dates don't show much interest in them. Kong replies that his mom was a plant enthusiast and that he's cared for many plants before. The girl gets even flirtier, asking if he knows how to take care of her little flower, but they're quickly interrupted by a guy telling her she's getting way too forward in front of Kong and they should leave. Watching the situation unfold, Lee assumes Kong isn't having any issues about the previous night. When the shop assistant calls her indecisive and asks if she's made up her mind, Lee suddenly stands up and, unable to contain herself, yells insults like bastard and jerk in Kang's direction, along with several other choice words. The outburst nearly prompts the assistant and the little troublemaker to call the nearest psych ward. Embarrassed by her second loud outburst of the day, Lee grabs the first plant she sees and says she's chosen that one. Upon looking closer, she realizes her pick looks more like a pea pod with a mouth. Lee stares at the little flower she chose for her project, still thinking about the meaning of the other plant, about how its meaning was unrequited love. She tries to convince herself that this meaning didn't apply to her, and that, in that slightly awkward moment between her and Kong, he was fully aware of his actions, and that she wouldn't be his unrequited love. She's really trying to convince herself that this is true, so she can move on. Trying to shift her thoughts, she remembers the tips the lady at the plant shop gave her about caring for her little green buddy, which was basically to water it when the plant looked wrinkled like a kid who spent the entire day in the pool. It seemed pretty simple to make the plant grow, but at that moment, something fell off. The little mouth of that olive plant seemed sad. Like any sensible person, she decides to Google it and grabs her phone to take a picture and start her research. As she's about to snap the photo, she gets a WhatsApp message from a contact she probably wished was just spam from Claro offering her a new phone plan. But no, it was the clingy friend, who was at a bar on a random Tuesday night, showing off her new gal pals. 3 girls with impossibly complicated Korean names. She says they're freshmen she bumped into at the bar, and they instantly hit it off and formed a genuine friendship. Before Lee can say anything, clingy friend's iPhone battery dies, leaving her a bit sad because she really wanted to keep chatting with Lee. Even while she was at the bar drinking with new friends, she couldn't let go of Lee. Then someone yells to the clingy friend that some guy named Uni is calling, making her surprised. thinking that her phone dying was probably a blessing. She starts downing beer mugs like there's no tomorrow. The clingy friend wakes up in the middle of nowhere, exhausted, not surprising after drinking like that, and realizes she's on the subway when the announcement chimes. Next stop, gang buy-in, transfer station for lines 1 and 2. Please exit to the left and mind the gap between the train and the platform. Hearing this, she panics and realizes she had been sleeping on the shoulder of a poor office worker sitting next to her. She shouts that she needs to get off urgently, gets up, and runs without looking back. After she leaves, the guy who had been her pillow notices a phone left on the seat. He picks it up and realizes it's the clingy friend's phone. At the same time, the clingy friend, unaware, keeps using contactless payment with the phone she has, celebrating that she woke up at the right moment and narrowly avoided disaster, blissfully ignorant of the mix-up. Now, back to the protagonist. She's doing her daily cardio, so she can later post on her stories saying, "Today's workout is done." This time, she's fueled by pure rage. Using the idle mind is the devil's workshop mentality and ends up spending 2.5 hours on the bike. After finishing her workout, she decides to rinse off. She's in her bathtub, relaxing, but wondering why she didn't use the main bathtub, which is much larger than the one she's in. Feeling a bit awkward, she notices that either her knees are sticking out or her upper body is exposed, and she starts thinking about all the trouble Kong would have using that tub, given that he's tall and undeniably attractive. She tries to shake off thoughts of Kong and stop thinking about him altogether. As the warm water makes Lee a bit drowsy, a hot, naked man suddenly appears in the tub. It's Kong, practically climbing in on top of her and staring into her eyes, asking what she's thinking about. Lee turns completely red, overwhelmed with embarrassment, and ends up slipping under the water. That's when she realizes she's just hallucinating, feeling crazy for imagining that man naked right in front of her. She wonders if she needs therapy, mentally scolding herself for still being affected by the day they almost kissed. After a full-blown internal meltdown, she gets out of the tub and decides to do some stretches to keep up her healthy lifestyle. As she's leaving the bathroom wrapped in her towel, she hears something. Could it be Kong coming home? But then she notices a small, inconvenient detail. She hadn't brought any clothes with her and was now stuck wearing only her little towel. Desperate, wondering what to do since she hadn't brought any clothes, Lee frantically searches for her phone. But, of course, her phone is also an iPhone and out of battery, throwing her into an existential crisis. She absolutely does not want to wander around the house in just a towel with Kong possibly being there. So she starts coming up with various plans. The first plan involves sneaking out at the exact moment Kong enters his room, tiptoeing silently to avoid making any noise or drawing attention. But then she imagines the possibility of him opening the door just as she's passing by, and the thought alone makes her immediately scrap the idea. It's a terrible plan. Her second plan is to sneak around like a mouse, waiting for the moment he leaves so she can dart quickly to her room. However, she realizes this plan has the same flaws as the first one, so she dismisses it as another terrible idea. Growing even more desperate, she remembers that Kong is a human too and will eventually need to use the bathroom. She pauses, reassesses the situation, and cracks the door open just a little to peek outside. She calls out for Kong, but gets no response. Suspicious, she starts wondering if this is some kind of prank for a TikTok video. Memories of Kang's childhood pranks flood her mind. Like the time he surprised her while she was secretly squashing a popsicle and teasingly asked about her diet. But she shakes herself back to the present, reminding herself they're not kids anymore. Surely he wouldn't pull something so irresponsible now, right? Finally, in a moment of sheer madness, she flings the door open, completely disregarding the fact that she's still only wearing a towel. The whole crux of her dilemma. She yells at Kong, accusing him of ignoring her on purpose because she knows he's home and just playing dumb. Yet, there's still no response. Frustrated, she starts searching the house, still in just a towel for the record, letting out another hysterical shout and realizing how much she'd panicked over nothing. As night falls, Lee is enjoying her delicious delivery from iFood when she gets a WhatsApp message from Kong. He tells her she can go ahead and eat without him. She immediately starts grumbling about that worm having already eaten, and with whom, she wonders, while remembering the rule Kong himself had set for the house. They were supposed to eat together. But apparently, that rule only applies when His Highness deems it necessary. She then questions if he might have the password to the house's electronic door lock and sends him a message just to be sure. Ready to sleep, Lee finds herself wondering if something strange might be going on with him. But then she just turns over in bed and mutters, And who said that's my problem? Moving on to another storyline, we return to Yuna, the blonde girl Lee had assumed was Kang's girlfriend. She's currently chatting with that poor guy whose phone was taken by the clingy friend on the subway, and they're, of course, discussing that very situation. Yuna tells the guy he should just get a new phone since it's been a while and no one has returned his calls. But the guy, who wears glasses and goes by the name Yuan, is incredibly slow to catch on. While Yuna keeps insisting he file a police report and buy a new phone, Yuan keeps thinking the only reason for the lack of response is that the person who took it just hasn't seen the calls yet. In his mind, there's no reason for someone to ignore him deliberately. Yuna, realizing how much of an idiot he really is, struggles to find kinder words to explain the situation. Losing his phone might be a rare occurrence for him, but it's happening frequently enough to make her question his common sense. Midway through the conversation, Kang shows up and asks why Yuna is scolding Yuan so harshly. Yuna wastes no time throwing it in his face that Yuan has had his phone stolen yet again. Seriously, is this manhwa set in Korea or Rio de Janeiro? And that he's still paying off the 12-month installment plan for the last one. Yuna goes on, saying she's been trying to convince Yuan to just give up on the stolen phone and buy a new one, and she even asks Yuan to confirm this by pinching his arm. In reality, she's not even trying to help him recover it anymore. She just wants him to move on. Everyone in the group agrees that being without a phone is awful and that Yuan should really get a replacement soon. After all, since Yuan hasn't been answering any WhatsApp messages, people have started pestering Yuna about him instead. Switching topics faster than a Formula One car, Yuna asks Kang about his classes, mentioning that hers have already ended and she's feeling bored. Being the polite guy he is, Kang asks what classes she had, and the conversation continues with the usual small talk. But Yuna quickly shifts into attack mode, boldly saying that if Kang isn't busy in the afternoon, she'd like to sit on him. Oops, she meant go out with him, and suggests a newly opened cafe as a potential date spot. As their conversation flows, in the background, Lee walks by with her ever-loyal clingy friend by her side. They spot Kang, and the clingy friend comments on Lee's friend being there. Seeing the blonde girl clinging to Kang's arm, Lee realizes that Kang is perfectly fine and that she'd been worried about him for no reason at all. They head to a vending machine to grab sodas, and the clingy friend comments that she thought Lee would go over to say hi to Kang. Playing dumb and taking a sip of her cold Coke, Lee casually says she won't because he's busy with his group of friends. The clingy friend, always full of innocent yet loaded questions, then asks if Lee and Kang had a fight. This makes Lee choke on her Coke. After crushing the can, with soda dripping down her face and her eye twitching in frustration, she snaps that they haven't fought. Lee checks her WhatsApp messages and mentions someone inviting her out for drinks, as any good university student would. Naturally, the clingy friend immediately invites herself along, as usual. But as Lee scrolls through more messages, she notices everyone asking the clingy friend to check in, suspecting she'd forgotten her phone at home. Lee deduces that her friend had likely overslept and left the house in a rush. Seriously, this girl wouldn't even remember her head if it weren't attached to her neck. Yet, true to her carefree nature, the clingy friend doesn't care about the situation and is only focused on the alcohol later, determined to drag Lee along no matter what, because, well, that's what clingy friends do. Later that night, Kang is on his date with Yuna. While on the balcony, he notices a man angrily scolding another guy, seemingly about underestimating customers. The other man, looking dejected, keeps apologizing. As Kang quietly watches this unfamiliar, yet dramatic scene unfold, he starts to wonder about the identity of the mysterious man. The sly blonde then approaches Kang and asks if something's going on. Still staring at the mysterious man, Kang replies that nothing is happening, at least not at that moment. Lee finds herself getting completely wasted, downing drink after drink, half venting about how annoying her current situation is. Then it hits her. She's sitting in the middle of a crowded table with a lot of other people. She suddenly asks why no one is asking her to pick her Black Knight, a bar game where someone chooses a person to drink their entire glass and then grants them a chance to make a request. She declares she's going to dominate this game, waste no time, and downs another big drink, leaving the clingy friend utterly shocked. However, that drink doesn't sit well with our protagonist, leaving her just 2 steps away from a full-blown blackout. The clingy friend, already imagining all the work she'll have to do to help the drunk Lee, hears her repeatedly saying that the alcohol is going down smoothly and that she's fine. Classic drunk behavior. At the end of the night, the clingy friend says goodbye to the others who are leaving and turns to see Lee completely out of it, practically a puppet with its strings cut. The clingy friend wonders what she should do, should she take Lee to her own house? But that doesn't seem like a good idea. Her first plan of action is to try waking up the drunkard, shaking Lee desperately. She keeps asking where her house is and yells straight into her soul that she needs to go home. But it seems Lee's soul has already left her body. That's when the Prince Charming of the night shows up, Kong, asking what they're doing there. At first, the clingy friend is a little stunned, but Kong quickly focuses on Lee, asking if she's okay and suggesting they get her some support. For the first time, Lee shows a reaction. Kong asks if she can walk, and in her drunken state, Lee slurs out, "You scoundrel," leaving literally everyone around completely shocked. The clingy friend tries to salvage the situation by explaining that Lee is just a little drunk and not great with alcohol, as if that wasn't already obvious. Kong bluntly responds that it's pretty clear. Kong then insists on taking Lee home, but the clingy friend finds his insistence suspicious and steps in, saying she'll take her friend home instead. However, Kong throws a curveball that leaves her speechless. He asks if the clingy friend even knows where Lee lives. Forced to lie on the spot, she claims she's been to Lee's place before, even throwing in a detail about having coffee there. But Kong isn't swayed and firmly states he'll take Lee home himself. The clingy friend tries to keep him from doing so, questioning why he's so determined to take Lee home. That's when Kong drops the biggest plot twist. He reveals that he's currently living with Lee. The clingy friend's brain, running on Windows XP, takes a moment to process this bombshell. Once it finally clicks, she's hit with one of the biggest shocks imaginable as she watches Kong carrying Lee on his back, heading off into the night. And with the intense stare they exchanged, and Kong pulling Lee even closer with his arm tightly around her, it became inevitable. Lee couldn't hold it in any longer, and before she could stop herself, she threw up her entire dinner all over Kong. It doesn't need to be said how mortified Lee was. But as she looked closer at his outfit, she noticed a few scattered stains on his shirt. A Louis Vuitton shirt, no less, which only made her panic even more. Lee was utterly embarrassed, not wanting to face Kong under any circumstances. So much so that whenever she needed to leave her room, she made sure first that Mr. Handsome wasn't home, just so she could go about her day without running into him. Later, at a cafe, Lee and the clingy friend are standing in line to order their drinks. Her friend picks hers, but at that exact moment, Kong shows up and asks for Lee. And where's Lee? The clingy friend starts looking around, trying to figure out where Lee could have gone. She checks her phone and finds it full of messages from Lee, begging her not to snitch and reveal that she's there. Trying to cover for her, the clingy friend lies to Kong, saying that Lee had just texted to say she was on her way and that Kong could go ahead and order first since she would be waiting for Lee. While Lee was furiously messaging her from her hiding spot, Kong scans the menu options, grumbling about how expensive everything is. But being the charmer he is, he casually asks the clingy friend what she wants to drink. At first, she tries to be modest and says she doesn't want anything, but after Kong insists, she finally chooses her drink. Meanwhile, Lee stays hidden, panicking and begging her friend to get Kong to leave as soon as possible. Kong, however, calmly strolls down the street with his coffee in hand, thinking to himself that he's no fool. It was obvious Lee had been hiding behind the counter the whole time. Back at the cafe, the clingy friend comments that Kong seems like a nice guy. Lee, however, shoots her a dark glare and asks if she really thinks he's that nice. The clingy friend doesn't understand why Lee seems so skeptical, especially since Kong even bought coffee for both of them. Lee, with no escape from the truth, is forced to grudgingly agree that Kong is in fact a nice guy. Her friend then asks why Lee hasn't taken a sip of her coffee yet. She explains that when Kong was buying his coffee and one for the clingy friend, he had left 2 cups with her. When asked if he was going to take the second coffee with him, Kong had simply replied that one's Lee's before opening the door and leaving. Lee felt a bit embarrassed, realizing that Kong had known she was hiding the entire time. She couldn't help but wonder how funny the whole scene must have looked to him. The clingy friend suddenly recalls Kong mentioning that he and Lee were now living together, and she quickly asks if something happened the previous night. Her excitement is palpable, as if she had downed 3 cans of Red Bull and prepped some popcorn to enjoy the story. From Lee's reaction, it seemed like something big must have happened, but the answer disappoints her. Lee simply says she threw up. Feeling let down, the clingy friend expected a juicier tale, but then Lee continues, revealing that she had actually thrown up on Kang's shirt. This revelation shocks the clingy friend, who tries to put on her motivational coach hat, saying that taking care of drunk friends sometimes results in such incidents. She reassures Lee that if the shirt is washed properly, it'll be fine. However, Lee adds a crucial detail. The shirt in question was from Louis Vuitton. This information leaves the clingy friend speechless, her brain hitting a mental pause as she struggles to process what to say. Lee tries to rationalize it, insisting it was just an accident and that there's no reason for Kong to be mad at her. She points out that she's never seen him angry. He's always the smile and wave boys type. But the clingy friend makes an astute observation. Just because he seems calm doesn't mean he isn't mad. He could be smiling and waving while seething inside. This analogy makes Lee even more anxious, and she bangs her head against the table, wondering why he wouldn't be upset with her. She even questions if the coffee Kong bought her might have been poisoned or if he bought it just to make her feel guiltier. Desperate, Lee asks what she should do. The clingy friend slams her glass down on the table and lays down her advice. Lee should stop being so ridiculous and just apologize to Kong face-to-face instead of avoiding him all the time. Lee's main concern, though, is whether Kong might ask her to pay for the damaged shirt. The clingy friend reminds her of her own words, that Kong doesn't stress about anything. So why would he start now? Suddenly, the clingy friend cuts the conversation short, realizing the phone she's been using isn't hers. She only notices because someone called about it, pointing out the mix-up. Finding the situation funny, she mentions that she's already arranged to meet the phone's owner to make the exchange. Coincidentally, the owner is a student at the same university. Later in class, the professor assigns a group project for 2 to 4 people, asking everyone to choose their own groups. For the friendless loners who don't find a group, he says they can email him, and he'll assign them. The class buzzes with activity as everyone starts forming groups. Lee asks the clingy friend if she already has a group, suggesting they work together. The clingy friend looks a little nervous, but before she can respond, Kong suddenly appears behind Lee, asking if he can join her group. Lee is startled, wondering where he came from, and tries to decline by saying she already planned to do the project with the clingy friend. Kong counters, asking why they can't make it a group of 3. It'd be ideal. If she's so against it, he suggests they add 1 more to make it a group of 4. Lee begins to think Kong wouldn't go to such lengths just to be in her group. But then he calls over Yuan, who, by an incredible coincidence, turns out to be the owner of the phone the clingy friend had been using. After Kong invited Yuan to join the group, he was surprised to find out that his friend was also in the same class as him. During this conversation, Lee couldn't stop wondering if the two of them already knew each other. Yuan started explaining that many people had dropped out of the course and simply left, while all the flirty girls in the class were impressed by the new guy, wanting to form a group with him. But Yuan, being the nerd he was, quickly ran off because he couldn't afford to be late for his next class, completely ignoring the idea of meeting his group members. Kong then turned to Lee and asked if everything was okay between them. Lee could only imagine the worst-case scenario, thinking about how no one in their right mind in that classroom would refuse such an offer. She apologized to the Garrapatta for the nosy guys who had joined their group, but the Garrapatta's mind was somewhere else. The only thoughts running through her head were about who that handsome new group member was. She casually asked about his age and whether he had a girlfriend. Kong, without much care, responded that it was Yuan, and he probably didn't have a girlfriend because, in his words, nerds don't date. While the Garrapatta was completely smitten, even with the guy's name, Kong began to ponder some things that wouldn't make her very happy. He asked if Yuan had been with a girl before, which made the Garrapatta sad. But then Kong guessed that maybe they had broken up, which cheered her up. Then he wondered if they might have gotten back together, making her sad again, but there was also a chance they hadn't, which made her happy once more. It was an incredible roller coaster of emotions. Lee, defending her friend, elbowed Kong to stop messing with the poor girl's heart. Kong then asked if Lee was heading home and suggested they go together. But Lee made up an excuse, saying she already had plans. When Kong asked what plans, she was left speechless. After thinking for a moment, she remembered the Garrapatta's club, which she had spent an entire chapter pestering Lee to join. Lee pulled the Garrapatta, who was still deeply affected by Kang's teasing about Yuan, to confirm the club's existence. However, the Garrapatta was so shaken that she didn't seem to care much about it. But Kong, like a puppy following its owner, said that since it was a club, it didn't matter what course someone was taking, and he decided he wanted to join too. Lee wondered what kind of joke this was, as she knew that Kong wasn't the type to enjoy exercising at all. He used the excuse that he had played basketball the other day. Lee gave him a look of disbelief, but she felt like she was letting her guard down around him. Quickly, she asked the Garrapato what she thought of the idea, but the Garrapato was still too upset to say anything. Kong seized the moment to push things further, dirtier than even Pigpen, and asked if Yuan might also want to join. He said it would be great if Yuan joined too. This sly dog was up to no good. Lee quickly warned Kong not to be so cheeky, but before she could do anything, the Garrapato was already ecstatic about the idea, wanting Yuan in the club as soon as possible. During the exercises, Lee couldn't stop thinking about the Garrapato, who had abandoned them to practice boxing somewhere far away, telling Lee to just apologize to Kong since he would forgive her. However, while they were exercising, an awkward silence filled the space. Lee imagined that Kang's mind was completely blank, though she was just as quiet herself. It was then that Kong suddenly spoke up, telling Lee he needed to buy new clothes, and if you look closely, check out the kind of clothes they were wearing for exercise. Naturally, Kang's comment worried Lee, because everyone knew what had happened to Kang's clothes. She tried to play dumb, asking what kind of clothes he needed to buy. Kong explained that he didn't have the right clothes to participate in the club. After all, he couldn't work out every week wearing jackets and jeans. He added that he planned to buy some on the way home. Lee silently braced herself for the moment Kong would bring up the vomit incident. But before he could, she preemptively asked about the clothes in question, wishing she could turn back time to avoid the whole situation. Kong, in a hippie-like moment, pondered aloud whether clothes were like people. Meanwhile, Lee was still obsessing over all the possible responses Kong might have about the damage to his clothes. Before the conversation could continue, a woman approached Lee. However, as soon as she noticed that the man next to Lee was Kong, she immediately shifted all her attention to him. Kong thanked her for some help she had given him, and the woman couldn't believe Kong even remembered her. During this exchange, Lee stood awkwardly in the background, quietly grumbling to herself about how this sort of thing kept happening. This triggered a memory from her childhood. Every time one of Lee's friends tried to talk to her, they would inevitably redirect their attention solely to Kong. These girls always used Lee as a stepping stone to get closer to the oh-so-handsome Kong. Now, Lee wondered if Kong had any idea how she felt about these situations. After all, he had been crossing certain boundaries in their relationship lately, and while nothing had explicitly happened, there was something undeniably strange going on between them. Just as Lee placed her hand on the woman's shoulder to shoo her away from her man, someone called her to set her up on a blind date.